The first thing I heard was crystal shattering across the ballroom floor. Not laughter, not music. Glass. Every conversation inside the Whitmore Country Club stopped dead at the same moment. I remember turning slowly toward the entrance while 100 wealthy wedding guests stared in complete silence. An elderly man near the front had gone pale as paper. His whiskey tumbler had slipped right out of his hand and exploded against the marble floor. His eyes were locked on me. Not on my sister in her wedding gown. Not on the groom. Me. The old man's lips trembled like he'd seen a ghost crawl out of a grave. Then he whispered the words that changed the entire night. "Holy shit," he breathed. "She's the Reaper widow of the Seals." You could feel the air leave the room. My father froze beside him. My mother looked confused. My sister Emily stopped smiling halfway through greeting her guests. And suddenly every person in that ballroom was staring at me like they were seeing me for the first time in their lives. Funny thing is, I'd been invisible to my family for almost 15 years. Especially after the war. Especially after Afghanistan. Especially after I came home different. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Claire Walker. I'm 38 years old, retired Navy Special Operations Support Command, though most of my service record still technically doesn't exist to the public. I live alone outside Virginia Beach with an old yellow lab named Murphy, and more silence than most people could tolerate. And 3 days before my sister's wedding, I almost didn't go home at all. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the invitation taped to the refrigerator when my phone rang. My mother. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hi, Mom." "Oh, good, you picked up." Her voice already sounded nervous. "Your father's been wondering if you're still coming." That made me laugh quietly. Dad wasn't wondering. Dad was hoping I wouldn't. "I bought the plane ticket," I said. "I'll be there Friday." A pause. Then the careful voice she always used around me. "That's good, sweetheart." Sweetheart? My mother started talking to me like I was fragile after my second deployment, like one loud noise might crack me open. She never used to sound afraid of me before the military. Before the newspapers started using words like classified combat operations and decorated service member. Before my divorce. "You'll stay at the house?" she asked. I booked a hotel. Another silence. Your own mother can say 1,000 things without opening her mouth. "You know your father didn't mean..." "Yes," I interrupted softly. "He did." I wasn't angry anymore, not really. That's the thing age does to you, especially after war. Eventually, the pain stops burning and turns cold instead. My father's exact words 6 years earlier still sat inside my memory clear as glass. The war destroyed you. Not hurt you. Not changed you. Destroyed. Like I'd been turned into something broken beyond repair. I'd just returned from my final deployment when he said it. I remember standing in my parents' kitchen wearing civilian clothes that still felt strange on my body. My hands shook back then. I barely slept. Sudden noises made my chest lock tight. Dad looked at me across the dinner table for a long time before finally saying it. "You came back colder than the battlefield." At the time, I honestly thought he was right. By Friday afternoon, I was driving through my hometown outside Richmond with both hands tight on the steering wheel. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The grocery store where Mom used to buy birthday cakes. The old gas station where my first car died senior year. The diner where my ex-husband proposed 20 years ago before either of us understood what military life actually costs people. I checked into a Marriott near the interstate instead of going straight to my parents' house. Cowardly, maybe. But after years overseas, I'd learned something important about survival. You don't walk willingly into emotional ambushes. That evening was the rehearsal dinner. Emily had chosen a beautiful waterfront restaurant overlooking the James River. White lights wrapped around the railings. Jazz music drifted through open windows. Rich people everywhere. The groom's family had money, serious money. Old Virginia money. Defense contracts, real estate, political connections. Exactly the kind of people my father spent his entire life trying to impress. When I walked inside, conversations lowered almost immediately. Not because anyone recognized me. Because military changes how you move. You stop wandering into rooms casually after enough years scanning exits and reading threats without thinking about it. My younger sister spotted me first. "Claire." Emily hurried over in a pale blue dress worth more than my monthly mortgage payment. She hugged me carefully like she wasn't sure I'd hug back. "You made it." "Would have been hard to miss your 5th reminder text." She smiled awkwardly. "Emily and I used to be close once. Before life split us into different worlds. She became the warm daughter, the easy daughter, the one who married dentists and hosted Christmas brunches and called home every Sunday. I became the daughter people discussed quietly behind closed doors." "How do I look?" she asked. "Nervous." "Thanks." I almost smiled. Almost. Then my father appeared beside us holding a bourbon glass. Harold Walker, 72 years old, broad shoulders gone softer with age but still carrying himself like the loudest man in every room. He looked me up and down. No hug. No welcome home. Just a long stare at the black dress I'd chosen specifically not to attract attention. "You couldn't smile a little tonight?" he asked quietly. There it was. Didn't even take 60 seconds. "I am smiling." "No," he muttered, "you're enduring." Emily immediately stepped between us. "Dad, please." But he kept staring at me. "The Whitmores are important people," he said. "Tonight isn't about you." Funny thing was, I'd spent most of my life trying desperately not to make anything about me. But families create their own stories about people eventually. And once they decide who you are, they stop looking any deeper. My father introduced me to guests all evening like I was some embarrassing side note attached to the family. "This is my older daughter Claire. She was in the military." Was. Never she served her country. Never she sacrificed. Just was. At one point, I overheard one woman whisper to another near the bar, "She looks intimidating." The other woman answered quietly, "She looks sad." That one hit closer. About an hour into dinner, I realized something else. Nobody had saved me a seat at the family table. Not one. I stood there holding my wine glass while servers moved around me and relatives avoided eye contact. Finally, Emily noticed. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Claire, I thought Mom." "It's okay." And honestly, it was. Because humiliation stops hurting so much after combat. Perspective changes permanently once you've watched folded flags handed to grieving mothers. Still, something inside me felt tired. Not angry. Just tired. Later that night, my father cornered me outside near the water before I could leave. The river reflected silver under the lights. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed heavily. "Tomorrow matters," he said. "Emily deserves one perfect day." "She will have one." He studied me carefully. "You know, people get uncomfortable around you." There it was again. The thing nobody says directly. Veterans come home carrying invisible weather inside them. And civilians sense it. "You walk around like you're still over there," he continued quietly. "Like part of you never came home." I looked out across the dark river. He wasn't entirely wrong. Finally, he said the words that stayed with me all night long. "The war destroyed you, Claire." I stood there silently for several seconds. Then I answered the only way I knew how anymore. Calmly. "You should get some sleep, Dad." And I walked away before he could see the look on my face. The next morning I stood in front of the hotel bathroom mirror at 6:30, staring at a woman I barely recognized anymore. Not because I looked old. Because I looked tired in places sleep could never fix. The overhead light caught the faint scar near my jawline, the one people politely pretended not to notice. My dark hair had more silver in it than last year. My shoulders still carried themselves too straight, too alert, even in silence. Military posture. Combat posture. You spend enough years overseas and your body forgets how to relax before your mind does. I adjusted the collar of my charcoal gray suit jacket and looked down at the small velvet box sitting beside the sink. Inside was my Navy Cross. I almost brought it to the wedding. Then I laughed at myself and snapped the box shut again. What kind of person wears medals to her sister's wedding? Besides, my family never cared about medals anyway. To them, military service had always been something abstract and uncomfortable, noble from a distance, inconvenient up close. Especially after I came home carrying pieces of war they couldn't understand. By 8:30, I was driving toward Whitmore Country Club under a pale Virginia sky. The roads were lined with old oak trees dripping Spanish moss, beautiful in the kind of quiet southern way tourists love. The country club itself looked like something out of an old political drama. White columns, massive fountains, valets in pressed uniforms guiding luxury cars into perfect lines. Money everywhere. The kind of money that smells like old leather chairs and private golf memberships. I parked at the far end of the lot on purpose. Less attention that way. Inside the ballroom buzzed with soft piano music and expensive conversations. Women in designer dresses floated between tables carrying champagne flutes. Men with silver hair discussed investments and defense contracts near the bar. I immediately felt the shift that always happens in rooms like that. People noticing me without understanding why. Not fear exactly. Instinct. A man near the entrance glanced at my hands, my posture, the way my eyes automatically tracked exits. Then he quietly stepped aside without realizing he'd done it. Combat veterans recognize each other even out of uniform. Sometimes civilians do too. Emily spotted me near the ballroom doors and hurried over. She looked beautiful. Really beautiful. Not just because of the dress, because she was happy. For a second I saw the little girl who used to crawl into my room during thunderstorms. "You came," she said softly. "Pretty sure weddings require that." She smiled nervously, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress. "You look nice." "So do you." "You could have worn a dress, though." There it was. Even today. I glanced down at my tailored suit. "It's a wedding, not a beauty pageant." Emily sighed quietly. "Claire, just try today, okay?" "Try what?" "Not scaring people." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I nodded once. Because arguing before a wedding helps nobody. A few minutes later, my mother rushed over, already flustered. "Claire, sweetheart, thank God." She grabbed my arm. "The seating cards got mixed up last night, but we fixed everything." "Of course they did." "Now." Mom adjusted my jacket gently. "You look thin." "You've said that every year since 2008. "That's because it's true." Her eyes softened suddenly. "You sleeping any better?" I hesitated. "Sometimes." She nodded like that answer hurt her. Before she could say more, my father appeared beside us wearing a navy tuxedo, and the same expression he always wore around wealthy people, desperate confidence. "Claire," he said sharply, "come meet the Whitmores." "Not would you like to?" "Just come." I followed him across the ballroom toward a cluster of elegantly dressed guests near the windows. As we walked, Dad leaned closer. "Please try not to be intense today." I almost laughed. Intense. You know what I mean. Actually, I didn't. But after years of these conversations, I'd learned asking only made things worse. The Whitmores looked exactly like old Virginia wealth usually looks. Conservative elegance, controlled smiles, expensive watches hidden beneath polite manners. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of the group, speaking with two older men about defense manufacturing. Tall, silver-haired, maybe late 60s. The groom Daniel noticed us first. "Mr. Walker," he said warmly. Dad immediately transformed into a different man entirely. Bigger smile, louder laugh. "Daniel, wonderful ceremony." Hasn't happened yet, I thought. But he was nervous enough to forget that. Then Dad placed a hand lightly against my back. "And this," he announced, "is my older daughter, Claire." There was the brief, awkward pause I'd grown used to over the years. People trying to figure me out. Dad filled the silence quickly. "She served in the military for a while." For a while. 15 years. 3 deployments. 2 classified commendations. 1 divorce. Several funerals. But sure. For a while. One older woman smiled tightly at me. "Oh goodness, Army. Navy. How interesting," she tilted her head. "You certainly carry yourself differently." Before I could answer, another guest chuckled lightly. "She looks like she could kill somebody." A few people laughed politely. I didn't. "Only when necessary," I said calmly. Silence. You could practically hear Emily cringing from across the room. Dad shot me a frustrated look. "See," that look said, "this is exactly what I mean." Richard Whitmore finally turned toward me fully then. At first, his expression remained polite and distracted. Then his eyes dropped briefly to my wrist. The small trident tattoo barely visible beneath my sleeve. Everything changed instantly. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. His mouth parted slightly. Not theatrical. Not exaggerated. Genuine shock. No, he whispered quietly. Dad frowned. Richard. But Richard kept staring at me like he'd opened a door to something he never expected to find standing there. His eyes narrowed slightly. Studying me. Remembering. I knew that look. I'd seen it before from retired officers and old intelligence men who recognized ghosts from classified briefings. You, he said slowly. The room grew strangely quiet around us. My stomach tightened. Not fear. Just exhaustion. I suddenly understood exactly where this conversation was heading, and I wanted no part of it. I stepped back politely. Excuse me, I said. But Richard moved closer instead. Commander Claire Walker. I froze. Not because he knew my name. Because he knew the rank. My father stared between us in confusion. Wait, Dad said awkwardly. You two know each other. Richard never took his eyes off me. No, he answered softly. But I know who she is. Every nerve in my body wanted to leave immediately. Not because I was ashamed. Because I hated this part. The staring. The mythology people build around war. The way civilians mistake survival for something glamorous. Sir, I said quietly, today is Emily's wedding. Meaning, please stop. Richard swallowed hard. Then he said words that turned the entire ballroom cold. Holy God. His voice trembled slightly. She's the Reaper widow. Nobody around us moved. My father blinked. The what? Richard looked at him in disbelief. You seriously don't know? And for the first time in my entire life, I watched my father become the smallest man in the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Richard Whitmore said the words. She's the Reaper widow. The ballroom seemed to shrink around me. I could hear silverware clinking faintly somewhere near the back of the room. A champagne cork popped in another corner. Normal wedding sounds continuing while the air around our little group turned painfully still. My father gave a short, nervous laugh. The Reaper what? Richard kept staring at me. Not with admiration. That's the part civilians never understand. Men who truly know war rarely romanticize it. Especially older men. Especially the ones who spent years around special operations personnel after 9/11. Richard looked unsettled, like a memory had just walked back into his life wearing civilian clothes. You honestly don't know who your daughter is? He asked quietly. Dad straightened a little. I know perfectly well who my daughter is. Do you? I almost said it out loud. Instead, I reached for a passing champagne glass from a server's tray and took a slow sip. Emily appeared beside us looking panicked. What's happening? Nothing, I said immediately. But Richard ignored me. I worked with Naval Special Warfare Procurement for years, he explained, still staring at me. There were stories. I closed my eyes briefly. Stories? That word again. War turns real human beings into stories for people far away from it. There's no need for this, I said calmly. Richard nodded once. You're right. But he still couldn't stop looking at me. The groom Daniel glanced between everyone awkwardly. Dad. Richard rubbed one hand across his mouth. I just never thought I'd see her standing at a wedding reception. There it was. Her. Not Claire. Not Commander Walker. Her. Like I was some classified rumor people whispered about over bourbon after Pentagon meetings. My father's face hardened slightly. Richard, he said carefully, I think there's been some misunderstanding here. Claire was in the Navy, yes, but she pulled men out of Kandahar during the Black Ridge operation. The words hit me like cold rain. Not because they were classified anymore. Most of that mission had eventually been buried beneath enough paperwork and redactions that pieces leaked through military circles over the years. But because I hadn't heard that mission name spoken aloud in over a decade. Black Ridge. Jesus. I could suddenly smell dust and smoke again. Hear rotor blades. Screaming over comms. I stared into my champagne glass. Sir, I said quietly, please. Richard immediately stopped. Good men recognize pain when they see it. Unfortunately, my father still looked confused instead. Kandahar, he repeated. Claire, what is he talking about? I met his eyes finally. You really want to do this here? That shut him up. Nearby guests had started pretending not to listen while listening to every word. Wealthy people are excellent at that skill. Emily touched my arm gently. Claire, what's Black Ridge? Her voice sounded small. I looked at my little sister standing there in her white wedding gown, and for a moment all I saw was the 16-year-old girl who cried when I left for boot camp. I never wanted her carrying images of war in her head. That's not important today. But Richard spoke softly. It's important because your family clearly spent years misunderstanding what happened to her. My father's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Richard, family matters are private. Richard gave a quiet, humorless laugh. You called her damaged 5 minutes ago. Dad froze. So did I. Apparently Richard had overheard more than I realized earlier. You said the war destroyed her, Richard continued. Do you have any idea what your daughter actually survived? My father looked embarrassed now. And angry. The dangerous combination proud men reach when humiliation starts cracking their ego. She came home different, Dad snapped. Colder, distant. Her marriage fell apart. She stopped talking to people. Because she went to war, Richard replied sharply. The room went silent again. Not dramatic silence. Heavy silence. The kind older people understand well. The silence that comes right before someone is forced to confront an ugly truth. I could see Emily beginning to shake slightly. Claire, she whispered what happened over there. I looked away toward the ballroom windows. Outside sunlight reflected beautifully across the golf course lake. Peaceful. Safe. Nothing like Afghanistan. I lost people, I said simply. Dad crossed his arms. Everyone loses people. I turned toward him slowly. And for the first time all weekend, something inside me cracked open. Not like that. My voice stayed calm. That almost made it worse. I watched 22-year-old boys bleed out asking for their mothers. I continued quietly. I zipped friends into bags, Dad. I wrote letters to wives explaining why their husbands weren't coming home. Nobody moved. You think I came back cold? I asked. I came back carrying ghosts. Emily suddenly covered her mouth. My mother looked near tears. But my father still looked defensive because some men mistake vulnerability for accusation. I didn't know, he muttered. I almost laughed. How could you not know? Then again, I never told them much. Classified work becomes a wall eventually. You stop explaining because you physically can't explain. And after a while, silence becomes habit. Richard spoke carefully now. There were men who credited her with saving entire extraction teams. Dad stared at him. My daughter wasn't SEAL Team 6. No, Richard answered softly. She was worse. That actually earned the faintest smile from me. Old special operations humor. Richard stepped closer. Do you know why they called her the Reaper Widow? I immediately shook my head. Please don't. But Emily whispered. Why? Richard hesitated, then answered quietly. Because she was usually the one bringing the dead home. I closed my eyes. There it was. The ugliest truth underneath every military nickname. Nothing glamorous. Nothing cinematic. Just grief. Mission after mission, casualty after casualty, I somehow survived while others didn't. Somebody started calling me widow after my third extraction operation involving fatalities. Then Reaper got added later by operators who thought dark humor made death easier to carry. It didn't. Dad looked physically ill now. You were bringing bodies home. I nodded once. That was part of it. Oh my God, my mother whispered. And suddenly I realized something painful. My family had spent 15 years imagining me as emotionally broken, without ever once asking what broke me. At that exact moment, another voice suddenly cut across the ballroom behind us. Commander Walker. I turned immediately. An elderly man stood near the reception tables wearing a dark suit with a navy pin attached to his lapel. Rear Admiral Thomas Reed, retired. I hadn't seen him since 2014. Even in his 70s, the man still carried himself like command authority wrapped in steel. The second our eyes met, he straightened instinctively. And before anyone in the ballroom fully understood what was happening, the Admiral saluted me. Every veteran in the room noticed instantly. Several older men rose from their chairs automatically. My father stared in disbelief. But the worst part, it wasn't the salute. It was the expression on the Admiral's face afterward. Not fear. Not awe. Respect. The kind my own father had never once shown me. After Admiral Reed saluted me, the ballroom never quite recovered. The music continued. People still smiled for photographs. Champagne still flowed from silver trays carried by nervous-looking servers. But the atmosphere had changed completely. You could feel it, like a pressure system rolling through a quiet town before a storm finally breaks. The veterans in the room kept glancing toward me now, some with curiosity, some with recognition, some with the uncomfortable understanding older servicemen carry when they realize another person has seen too much. Meanwhile, my father looked like a man who'd accidentally walked into the wrong church halfway through confession. Admiral Reed lowered his salute slowly and approached me with the careful stiffness age gives retired officers. "Claire," he said warmly, "didn't know you were stateside. Been retired almost 2 years now." He nodded. "You look tired." I smiled faintly. "You too, sir." That actually made him laugh. Around us, guests pretended not to stare. Emily stepped closer carefully. "You know an admiral." Before I could answer, Reed looked directly at her. "Your sister saved American lives overseas." Simple. Direct. No theatrics. And somehow that landed harder than anything Richard Whitmore had said. Emily's eyes immediately filled with tears. My father still looked stunned. "You never told us any of this." I finally turned toward him fully. "You never asked." That one hurt him. I saw it immediately. Good. Not because I wanted revenge exactly. At 38, revenge feels less satisfying than younger people imagine. Mostly you just want acknowledgement. Truth. Maybe dignity. My mother quietly touched Dad's arm. "Harold?" But he kept staring at me. "You were really involved in all that." All that. Funny phrase. As if war were some messy side project I forgot to mention. I looked across the ballroom toward the massive windows overlooking the golf course. Then I answered honestly. Yes. No details. No dramatic stories. Just yes. Because there are memories veterans learn to keep locked down if they want to survive civilian life. Unfortunately, Richard Whitmore chose that exact moment to continue talking. "You know," he said quietly to Dad, "there were people in D.C. who thought your daughter should have received the Medal of Honor." I closed my eyes briefly. Jesus Christ. Richard I warned softly. But older men with guilt sometimes keep talking because silence suddenly feels cowardly. She ran extraction under direct fire 3 separate times during Black Ridge. Emily whispered. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Admiral Reed spoke. "It means other people were retreating," he said carefully, "and your sister went back in." The ballroom felt smaller by the second. I hated this. Not because the stories embarrassed me. Because dead people deserve privacy too. Every military hero story is built on somebody else's funeral. Dad looked shaken now. "Claire," I cut him off gently. "Can we please stop discussing Afghanistan at Emily's wedding?" Thank God Emily finally stepped forward. "She's right." Her voice cracked slightly. "This isn't about war." For a moment I thought the situation might finally settle down. Then one of the older guests near the bar approached slowly. Marine Corps veteran by the posture, mid-70s. He looked at me carefully before speaking. "My grandson served in Helmand Province," he said quietly. "He used to talk about a woman called Widow." My chest tightened immediately. The old man swallowed hard. "He came home because of her." I looked down at my hands. "Sir?" "He killed himself 3 years later," the man continued softly. "But he made it home first." That one almost broke me. Because that's the part civilians rarely understand about modern war. Getting soldiers home alive doesn't always save them. Sometimes the battlefield follows them back. The old Marine gently squeezed my shoulder once before walking away. And suddenly the ballroom noise felt very far away. I needed air. Without another word, I stepped outside through the side doors overlooking the water behind the country club. The October breeze felt cool against my face. For several minutes I just stood there alone, listening to distant laughter drift from inside. Weddings are strange after war. Too much happiness in one room can make damaged people feel like intruders. A few minutes later, the doors opened quietly behind me. Emily, still wearing her wedding gown. Still carrying that worried little girl expression she'd had since childhood. "You disappeared." I needed a minute. She nodded slowly and stepped beside me, overlooking the lake. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she finally whispered, "Were you really that famous?" I laughed softly. Famous. God. Number. But they looked terrified. Not terrified. I paused. Careful. Emily wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. Dad always said the military changed you. It did. But not like this. There it was again. The realization slowly hitting her. For years, my family had reduced everything complicated about me into one simple explanation. Claire became difficult. Claire became cold. Claire became distant. None of them had ever stopped to ask why. Emily's voice grew smaller. Were you scared over there? That question nearly undid me more than all the military talk inside. Because she sounded like my baby sister again. Not a bride. Not an adult woman. Just Emily. I stared out across the dark water. Every day. She looked shocked. You. I almost smiled. Especially me. Fear keeps people alive. The fearless ones usually come home in flag-draped coffins. I thought special operators weren't afraid. That's movie nonsense. I glanced toward her. The brave people are usually terrified. They just keep moving anyway. Emily wiped at her eyes carefully. I'm sorry. For what? For believing Dad. That hit deeper than she realized. I leaned against the railing quietly. Your whole life they compared us differently, she continued. You were the difficult daughter. I was the easy one. You were never easy, I said dryly. That made her laugh through tears. Then her expression turned serious again. When you came home after deployments, I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. Neither did I. That was the truth nobody says out loud about veterans returning home. Families expect reunions. What they actually get are strangers trying to recognize each other again. I thought maybe you stopped loving us, Emily whispered. I looked at her sharply. Number. Then why'd you stay away so long? Because it was easier. Because silence feels safer than disappointing people. Because once civilians decide you're damaged, eventually you start believing them. But I couldn't say any of that out loud. Before I answered, the doors behind us opened again. This time it was Dad. He looked older than he had yesterday. Older than he had that morning even. For several seconds he simply stood there staring at us. Then his eyes settled on me. I need to ask you something, he said quietly. I already knew the question before he spoke it. How many men died under your command? The wind moved softly across the lake. And for the first time since returning home, I saw genuine fear in my father's eyes. Not fear of me. Fear for me. My father stood across from me beside the lake, waiting for an answer neither of us truly wanted to hear. Behind him, warm golden light spilled from the ballroom windows. I could still hear muffled music drifting through the glass. Somewhere inside, guests were laughing politely over wedding cake and expensive bourbon. But out there by the water, none of that mattered anymore. How many men died under your command, he repeated quietly. Emily inhaled sharply beside me. I looked at my father for a long moment before answering. I stopped counting. The truth landed harder than any dramatic number could have. Dad's face tightened. Not judgment this time. Pain. I think that was the moment he finally understood war isn't measured by medals or headlines. It's measured by names you carry forever. I didn't know he whispered again. This time I believed him. Because people my father's age grew up in a different America. A quieter America. Soldiers came home from Vietnam broken in ways nobody knew how to discuss, so entire generations learned to avoid uncomfortable conversations altogether. Men buried pain. Women carried families. And trauma sat silently at dinner tables for decades. Dad took a slow breath. When you were little, he said carefully, you used to cry if birds hit the windows outside. I smiled faintly despite myself. I remember. You buried a dead squirrel in the backyard when you were 9 because you didn't want it left alone. Emily laughed softly through tears. Oh my God, I forgot about that. Dad stared at me. I can't reconcile that little girl with... With what? He looked away toward the dark lake. With someone people call Reaper Widow. There it was. The thing haunting him. The nickname. not understanding how war could turn a gentle child into something whispered about by hardened military men. I leaned against the railing slowly. It didn't turn me into something else, I said. It forced me to survive things. Dad rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. That's worse. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Emily quietly asked, "What really happened in Afghanistan?" I closed my eyes briefly. Some memories age like rusted metal. Touch them years later and they still cut. But for the first time in my life, my family wasn't asking out of curiosity. They were asking because they finally wanted to understand me. So I answered. Black Ridge was supposed to be a simple extraction, I said quietly. Intel went bad. Even now my voice automatically flattened into operational calm whenever discussing combat. Training never leaves completely. A SEAL reconnaissance team got trapped inside a valley compound after insurgents intercepted their route. They were outnumbered and cut off. Emily looked pale already. Dad listened silently. We lost air support because of a sandstorm. Communications kept dropping. Nobody could get to them. I stared out at the water. But somebody had to try. The October wind carried distant laughter from inside the ballroom. Funny how life keeps moving while people describe the worst moments they've ever lived through. We got there too late for some of them, I continued quietly. My father swallowed hard. How old were they? Most 23, 24. Jesus. The expression on Dad's face shifted immediately. Because suddenly those weren't soldiers anymore. They were boys. Somebody's sons. 2 operators were still alive when we reached the compound, I said. One had lost most of his leg. The other was burned badly enough he couldn't see. Emily covered her mouth. I kept going anyway. Extraction helicopters couldn't land under fire, so we had to carry them nearly 2 miles through the ridgeline. Dad's voice sounded strained now. And you went back? I nodded once. 3 times. Why? That question nearly made me laugh. Because soldiers over 60 usually understand the answer instinctively. You go back because somebody would have gone back for you. That's what we do, I said simply. Dad stared at me like he was trying to rebuild his understanding of his own daughter piece by piece. What about the others? He asked carefully. I looked down. We brought everybody home. Silence settled again. Heavy silence. The kind older Americans know well. The kind built from funerals, regrets, and things people wish they'd said sooner. Finally, Emily whispered. And after that, you were different. I almost smiled sadly. Number. I looked at her. I was already changing long before that. Because war doesn't destroy people all at once. It happens slowly. Conversation by conversation. Funeral by funeral. You lose the ability to explain ordinary life to yourself. Then eventually you lose the ability to explain yourself to ordinary people. Dad sat down heavily on a nearby bench overlooking the lake. For the first time in my entire life, he looked small to me. Not weak. Just human. I thought you stopped caring about this family, he admitted quietly. That one hurt more than I expected. I stopped knowing how to fit into it. He nodded slowly like the answer made terrible sense. You'd come home and sit there silently during Christmas dinner, he said. You'd stare at doors, windows, crowds. I was checking exits, even around us. Yes. The word came out before I could soften it. Dad looked devastated. And suddenly I regretted saying it. Not because it wasn't true. Because parents aren't built to hear their children describe living in survival mode. I thought you were judging us, he said quietly. Number. I sat beside him. I was trying to calm my nervous system enough to feel safe indoors. That finally broke something in him. My father lowered his head into his hands. Oh God. I'd seen men cry in combat zones before. Usually older men. Usually after the danger passed. This looked exactly the same. I failed you, he whispered. I immediately shook my head. Number. Yes. His voice cracked sharply. You came home carrying all that, and all I could think about was how uncomfortable you made people. Emily started crying openly now. I thought if I pushed you hard enough, Dad continued, you'd become normal again. Normal. That impossible word veterans spend years chasing. I stared across the lake quietly. There's no going back after some things, I said softly. Dad looked at me with tears in his eyes. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Did anybody ever help you carry it? I thought about that for a long time. The truth surprised even me. Not really. That answer seemed to physically wound him. Inside the ballroom, the DJ announced the father-daughter dance. Emily wiped her face quickly. That's our cue. Dad stood slowly, but before heading inside, he turned toward me again. His voice sounded older than I'd ever heard it. I spent 15 years believing the war destroyed my daughter. He swallowed hard. But maybe it was the silence afterward that did the real damage. And for the first time since coming home, my father finally saw me clearly. The wedding ended later than expected. By the time the final guests drifted toward the valet stand and the ballroom lights dimmed low, the October air had turned cold enough to fog the windows. I was standing alone near the parking lot watching leaves scrape across the pavement when I heard footsteps behind me. My father. For a second, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man who'd spent an entire day discovering how wrong he'd been about someone he loved. You leaving? He asked quietly. Probably best. He nodded once, though he clearly hated the answer. The valet station lights reflected across his tired face. I suddenly noticed how old he'd become, the deep lines around his mouth, the slight stiffness in his shoulders. War ages soldiers. Regret ages parents. I used to brag about you when you were little, he said unexpectedly. I glanced at him. You did? All the time. A faint smile crossed his face. You climbed everything, trees, roofs, that terrible swing set I built. I laughed softly. You fell off the garage once. You told me not to cry because astronauts probably fell worse than that. That earned a real smile from me. Small, but real. Dad looked down at the pavement. Then somewhere along the line, I stopped understanding you. The wind moved quietly through the dark trees around the country club. I didn't know how to talk to the version of you that came home, he admitted. Neither did I. That was the tragedy underneath so many American families after war. People expect soldiers to return exactly the same, then panic when they don't. Dad shoved his hands into his coat pockets. When your marriage ended, he paused carefully, I blamed you. I looked away toward the empty parking lot. I know. He came to me one night after you deployed again. Dad's voice sounded ashamed now. Your ex-husband said he felt like he was living with somebody who never fully unpacked her bags. I closed my eyes briefly. David. Jesus. There are some wounds age never fully dulls. He said you stopped sleeping beside him, Dad continued quietly. Stopped laughing. Stopped talking. I stopped sleeping at all. Dad swallowed hard. I should have realized something was wrong. I stared out into the dark. You know the strange thing, I said softly. I kept waiting for somebody to ask me if I was okay. That one nearly broke him again. Because parents hear every version of their failures eventually. Some just arrive later in life. A car door slammed somewhere across the parking lot. Then silence returned. I thought strength meant handling things yourself, Dad admitted. That's how your generation survived. He nodded slowly. That's also how we destroyed ourselves. For several moments we simply stood there together beneath the yellow parking lot lights. Not fixing 15 years? Just finally telling the truth about them. Then Dad looked at me carefully. Why didn't you ever tell us how bad it was? I smiled sadly. Because every time I tried, people looked horrified. That was the reality nobody prepares veterans for. Civilians love the idea of sacrifice. Until sacrifice starts describing real things. Real blood. Real nightmares. Real funerals. You stopped asking after a while, I continued. Mom got nervous whenever Afghanistan came up. Emily changed the subject. You got angry. Dad stared at the ground. I thought talking about it would make things worse. Silence made things worse. The words settled heavily between us. Inside the building, staff members were clearing tables and shutting down the reception. The wedding was over. But something else had finally begun. Dad looked toward the ballroom doors. Come inside one more time. I don't think that's necessary. It is. His tone surprised me. Not commanding. Certain. A few minutes later, we walked back into the nearly empty ballroom together. Only close family remained now. My mother, Emily and Daniel, A few relatives gathering coats near the exits. Conversation stopped immediately when they saw us. Dad moved slowly toward the center of the room. Then he did something I never expected to see for the rest of my life. He cleared his throat nervously and addressed the room. "I need to say something." Emily looked confused. Mom already seemed emotional again. Dad turned toward me fully. "When Claire came home from the military, I thought the war had destroyed my daughter." The room went completely silent. "But tonight I realized something." His voice cracked slightly. "The war didn't destroy her." He swallowed hard. "It revealed how weak the rest of us were." I immediately shook my head. "Dad." "Number." For the first time in years, he interrupted me gently instead of dismissively. "I spent 15 years punishing you for surviving things I couldn't even imagine." Tears filled my mother's eyes. Emily was openly crying again beside Daniel. Dad kept going anyway. "You came home carrying grief, trauma, guilt, and instead of helping you carry it, I treated you like an embarrassment." The room felt painfully still. "I kept saying the military made you cold." His voice broke completely now. "But maybe you were just exhausted from carrying pain alone." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And suddenly I realized something shocking. My father had been carrying shame too. Not because of me. Because deep down he knew he'd abandoned his daughter emotionally when she needed him most. He stepped closer carefully. "I am so sorry, Claire." Not polished. Not dramatic. Just honest. And somehow honesty hits harder after 60 than pride ever does. I looked at him for a long time. Then I saw it. Not the stubborn businessman. Not the critical father. Just an aging man terrified he'd run out of time to repair his family. Emily suddenly crossed the room and hugged me tightly. For years, physical affection between us had felt awkward and forced. Not this time. "I'm sorry too," she whispered through tears. "I should have tried harder." I hugged her back carefully. Then my mother joined us. Then somehow all four of us ended up standing there together in the middle of a half-empty ballroom, holding onto each other like survivors after a storm. Even Daniel looked emotional. Richard Whitmore watched quietly from across the room before finally approaching me one last time. "You know," he said softly, "there are men in Washington who still talk about you like a ghost story." I shook my head faintly. "They should talk about the ones who didn't come home." Richard nodded immediately. "That's exactly why they respect you." For once, I didn't argue. Several weeks later, I was still in Virginia. Longer than I'd stayed in years. Dad started attending counseling sessions for military families at the local Veterans Center after Emily pushed him into going. Turns out he wasn't alone. Room after room filled with aging parents, spouses, and children quietly admitting the same thing. We didn't know how to bring them home. Neither did the veterans. That was the heartbreaking part. We were all improvising. One Saturday morning, Dad and I sat on his back porch drinking coffee while autumn leaves drifted across the yard. Peaceful. Ordinary. The kind of morning I used to think I'd never deserve again. "You know," Dad said quietly, "you finally seem lighter." I looked out toward the trees. Maybe because somebody's helping me carry it now. He nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, he said the words I'd waited years to hear. "I'm proud of you, Claire. Not for medals. Not for combat. For surviving." And strangely enough, that mattered more. If this story touched you in some way, maybe take a moment tonight to call someone who came home different. A veteran, a spouse, a parent. Sometimes people don't need perfect words. They just need to know they were never carrying it alone. And if you believe stories about healing family and second chances still matter, don't forget to share, subscribe, and spend a little more time listening to the quiet people in your life. Sometimes silence is where the deepest battles are hiding.